Imagine walking into class, handing in your hard work, only to find a teacher's insult scribbled across your paper. An insult not just aimed at your work, but at who you are, where you come from, and what you stand for. This is the story of a young boy who thought he was ordinary until one moment of prejudice changed everything and unleashed a power within him that even his teacher couldn't see coming. Stick around as we uncover a journey of identity, resilience, and an unexpected twist that will leave you speechless. And if you're new here, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. We've got more stories that inspire, challenge, and keep you on the edge of your seat. You won't want to miss what's next. It was just another ordinary day at the bustling high school in Brookdale, a suburb where wealth was old, privilege was inherited, and diversity was more of a theory than a reality. The school hallways brimmed with activity as students navigated their academic and social lives, eager to make it through another day. In Mrs. Amanda Whitmore's class, however, something unusual was about to happen. Jeremiah Johnson, a quiet but intelligent sophomore, sat in the back row as usual, his worn-out sneakers tapping silently on the tiled floor. He was one of the few black students in the predominantly white institution. His friends knew him as someone who excelled in sports and literature alike, a young man who read James Baldwin in his spare time but could also dunk on the basketball court like a future NBA player. His teachers, though, saw him differently. Mrs. Whitmore, in particular, saw him as an anomaly, a boy she couldn't fit into her narrow worldview. Mrs. Whitmore was an older teacher with a reputation for being strict and traditional, but there were whispers about her sharp tongue and her biased attitude toward students of color. She never outwardly insulted anyone. It was the small, subtle acts of microaggression, the way she ignored raised hands from students like Jeremiah or the patronizing tone she used when addressing them, that gave her away. On this particular day, Mrs. Whitmore was returning graded homework assignments. As she made her way through the rows, the stack of papers in her hand thinned out. She stopped at Jeremiah's desk and handed him his paper with an unmistakable smirk. Jeremiah glanced down at it and froze. Written in red ink at the top of his paper were the words, "You'll never amount to anything, no matter how hard you try. Maybe your people aren't meant for academic success." For a moment, Jeremiah couldn't breathe. The insult, camouflaged as feedback, hit him like a punch to the gut. The letters seemed to grow bigger, the red ink bleeding into the white paper as if it were searing into his brain. Around him, the class continued as usual, oblivious to the storm brewing inside Jeremiah's chest. Mrs. Whitmore moved on, her face devoid of remorse, as if she hadn't just written something that could crush a young person's spirit. Jeremiah sat motionless, staring at the paper, unsure of what to do next. The ride home from school that day was a blur for Jeremiah. The streets of Brookdale, lined with pristine lawns and luxury cars, felt like a foreign land he no longer belonged to. His mother, Grace, a nurse who worked long hours, greeted him with her usual warm smile when he walked in the door, but he couldn't bring himself to return it. "Hey, honey, how was school today?" she asked, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. Jeremiah hesitated, his mind racing. He didn't want to worry his mom. She had enough on her plate already. But how could he keep this to himself? Mrs. Whitmore's words echoed in his head, taunting him. "It was fine, Mom," he finally said, trying to muster a casual tone. Grace didn't push. She trusted her son and knew he would open up if something was wrong. Jeremiah retreated to his room, pulling out the crumpled homework paper from his bag. He stared at the insult again, trying to make sense of it. Why had she written that? Was it just him, or was there something deeper at play? Later that evening, as he lay in bed, Jeremiah's thoughts turned to his father. He had never met him. His dad had left when he was a baby. All he knew about the man was that he was someone important, someone powerful in ways that went beyond material wealth. His mom had always spoken about him with a kind of reverence, as if the mere mention of his name carried weight. But Jeremiah didn't feel powerful. He felt small, insignificant, and deeply wounded by the words of a teacher who was supposed to nurture his growth. Sleep evaded him that night, as the question kept circling in his mind. What if Mrs. Whitmore was right? Days passed, and though Jeremiah tried to push Mrs. Whitmore's words to the back of his mind, they lingered like a bad smell he couldn't escape. His performance in class started to drop. He became quieter, more withdrawn, and the spark that usually lit his eyes when he engaged in discussions dimmed. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling day, Jeremiah's mother sat him down at the dinner table. "Jeremiah, what's going on? You've been off lately. Talk to me." Jeremiah bit his lip, trying to hold back the frustration and anger that had been festering inside him. "Mom, have you ever felt like, no matter what you do, people just see you as nothing?" Grace's heart sank. She recognized the weight of those words, the pain behind them. "What happened, baby?" Jeremiah hesitated, then handed her the homework paper. Grace's face darkened as she read the cruel comment. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Who wrote this?" "Mrs. Whitmore," Jeremiah replied quietly. "I don't get it, Mom. I've never done anything to her. I try my best in her class, but she treats me like I don't belong there." Grace took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She had faced prejudice herself, more times than she could count, but seeing her son go through it was a different kind of pain. "Jeremiah, listen to me. You are not what she says you are. You are intelligent, you are capable, and you are destined for greatness." Her words were strong, but Jeremiah could see the hurt in her eyes. She hadn't expected him to face this kind of hatred, not in a town like Brookdale where people prided themselves on being progressive and educated. "I want to know who your father is," Jeremiah blurted out, the words surprising even himself. Grace's eyes widened. "Why now?" "Because I feel like I need to know where I come from. I need to understand why people like Mrs. Whitmore think they can just write me off like I'm nothing." Grace sighed, wiping a tear from her eye. "Your father is a man who commands respect, Jeremiah. But he's not here because he had to make difficult choices. Choices to protect you, even if it meant leaving. But maybe it's time for you to know the whole story." The following weekend, Grace drove Jeremiah out of Brookdale, heading toward the city. As the suburban landscape gave way to towering skyscrapers and bustling streets, Jeremiah felt a sense of anticipation building within him. They pulled up outside a grand office building with the names Johnson and Associates emblazoned on the front. Jeremiah looked at his mother, confused. Grace took a deep breath and said, "Your father is in here." Jeremiah's heart pounded. He followed his mother into the building, where they were quickly escorted to a private office. The door opened to reveal a tall, imposing man in his 50s with sharp eyes and a commanding presence. His suit was impeccable, and everything about him screamed power and authority. But when he looked at Jeremiah, there was something else, something softer. "Jeremiah," the man said, his voice deep and steady. "It's good to finally meet you." Jeremiah stood frozen, unsure of what to say. This was his father? The man who had never been there for him? "I owe you an explanation," the man continued, motioning for them to sit. "My name is Richard Johnson. I'm a lawyer, and I've spent my life fighting for justice, for people like us who have been told we don't belong." Jeremiah's mind raced. His father was a civil rights attorney? A man who fought against the very kind of hatred he had just experienced? "I left because there were people who wanted to hurt me, to hurt you, because of the work I was doing," Richard explained. "I didn't want you growing up in danger. But I've kept tabs on you, Jeremiah. I know you're smart, talented, and you have a bright future ahead of you. Don't let people like Mrs. Whitmore dim your light." Hearing those words from his father felt like a weight being lifted off Jeremiah's shoulders. He had always wondered about his father, and now, here he was, a man who had dedicated his life to fighting for justice. Back in Brookdale, Jeremiah's newfound knowledge of his father's legacy gave him a sense of empowerment he hadn't felt before. He knew he couldn't let Mrs. Whitmore's words define him. He decided it was time to confront her. One afternoon, after class, Jeremiah stayed behind. Mrs. Whitmore looked up from her desk, surprised to see him. "Jeremiah, can I help you with something?" she asked, her voice dripping with false politeness. "I wanted to talk to you about this," Jeremiah said, pulling out the homework paper with her insulting comments scrawled across it. Mrs. Whitmore's face hardened. "I stand by what I wrote. Some people just aren't cut out for academic success." Jeremiah's jaw clenched, but he remained calm. "You don't know anything about me." "I know enough," she replied, her voice icy. "No, you don't," Jeremiah said, his voice steady. "You don't know who my father is." You don't know where I come from. You see me, and you think you know my worth, but you don't. You'll never know what I'm capable of." Mrs. Whitmore looked taken aback, clearly not expecting such a direct challenge. "I'll be reporting this to the principal," Jeremiah continued. "And I'll make sure everyone knows the kind of person you really are." Jeremiah's report led to an investigation into Mrs. Whitmore's behavior, and soon, other students came forward with similar stories of discrimination and microaggressions. Within weeks, Mrs. Whitmore was asked to resign from her position, her legacy tarnished by the truth. Jeremiah, empowered by his father's legacy and his own resilience, began to thrive in school again. He poured his energy into his studies and basketball, knowing that he had the strength to overcome any obstacle placed in his path. He realized that Mrs. Whitmore's words, as hurtful as they were, had not broken him. Instead, they had led him to uncover a part of himself he had never known, a part connected to his father's legacy and the fight for justice. As he walked through the halls of Brookdale High, Jeremiah held his head high, knowing that his worth wasn't determined by the color of his skin or the biases of others. He was destined for greatness, and nothing, not even the cruelty of a racist teacher, could stand in his way.